What if everything you think you know about ancient sacred fire rituals is only a fraction of a truth far more disturbing? Imagine standing at the entrance of a Phoenician temple, the air thick with resin, smoke, and whispers, and being told that certain individuals were not just participants in the rites, but were chosen to embody the fire itself. Why would priests select living human beings to play a role so dangerous that even neighboring cultures recoiled in fear? This question alone pushes us directly into the darkest corner of Phoenician spirituality, where devotion, power, and terror merged into a single blazing symbol. When we look closely at these rituals, we begin to understand that the chosen of fire were not simply followers. They were instruments crafted by the priesthood to feed a belief system built on sacrifice, obedience, and mystery. As travelers and traders described from afar, these ceremonies were not meant to be witnessed by outsiders. The temple doors would close, and once they did, the boundaries between faith and cruelty dissolved completely. The priests believed that fire had its own will, a divine hunger that required human presence to reveal omens and shape destiny. Those chosen were told they carried a sacred duty, but many accounts suggest fear outweighed any sense of honor. The priesthood carefully controlled every detail of the narrative, using symbols, tales of divine punishment, and the imposing structure of the temple itself to maintain absolute dominance. Inside, the glow of burning oils created shadows that danced like spirits, and the chants of the clergy intensified the sense of inevitability. The chosen of fire often entered this space believing they would be transformed, purified, or elevated, only to discover that the path ahead was far harsher than anything they had imagined. And as the fire grew, so did the weight of the priestly expectations placed upon them. You may wonder whether anyone truly accepted this fate, willingly, or whether the psychological pressure exerted by the clergy left them without any real choice. Have you ever felt trapped by something presented as sacred or necessary? What you will uncover here might surprise you, especially when we explore how each stage of the ritual was designed to break resistance and shape obedience. If this beginning resonates with you, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me whether you had ever heard about rituals like this, or if this is your first time confronting these darker interpretations of ancient beliefs. Your engagement helps this investigation reach more people, so make sure to like the video and check whether you are already subscribed to the channel. What comes next will take us even deeper into the hidden mechanisms behind these rites, guiding us toward the moment when the selection of the chosen revealed the true intentions of the priesthood, and the fire itself became a test no one could escape. The selection of the chosen of fire did not happen in the open, nor through any process that resembled fairness or divine inspiration. It unfolded behind layers of silence, controlled entirely by priests who understood the psychological effect of being watched, evaluated, and judged under the weight of the temple's authority. Those who were eventually chosen rarely knew the true reasons behind their selection. To the public, the priesthood claimed that divine signs guided their decisions, but inside the IBTU temple walls, the criteria were far more calculated. Individuals who showed unwavering devotion were considered useful, but so were those who appeared vulnerable or easily manipulated because their fear reinforced the narrative of submission the priesthood demanded. Once a person became a potential candidate, subtle tests began. Priests observed how they reacted to stories of the fire's purifying power, how they behaved in the presence of sacred symbols, and whether they questioned any aspect of the doctrine. Doubt, even if slight, was noted and could either exclude them or mark them as perfect subjects for the next stage. The most unsettling detail from surviving accounts suggests that the priests sometimes targeted individuals who were isolated within their families or communities, knowing that a lack of support made them easier to control. This strategy allowed the clergy to present the ritual as an honor while ensuring minimal resistance. Rumors within the ancient cities claimed that the priesthood occasionally manipulated omens, creating the illusion that the gods had personally selected the next chosen. A flicker in the flame, a sudden gust of wind, the crack of burning cedar. All of these signs were interpreted theatrically by the priests to produce awe. Witnesses described the atmosphere as suffocating, like being caught in a trap disguised as divine ceremony. It is no coincidence that those chosen often felt the decision was irreversible the moment it was announced. Once the priest placed a hand on their shoulder and proclaimed the will of the gods, even the bravest felt their strength dissolve. From that moment forward, the life of the chosen individual changed completely. They were separated from the rhythm of ordinary existence and drawn into a controlled environment where every action was observed. Meals were given at specific times, conversations were limited, and the priests introduced them to symbolic teachings meant to reshape their perception of the ritual they would soon face. In these carefully engineered conditions, fear could be molded into acceptance, and acceptance into surrender. Some accounts describe an early stage where the chosen were shown the ceremonial fire from a distance, the flames rising like a living creature. The priests used this moment to reinforce the idea that the fire recognized them, that it awaited them. The psychological manipulation was deliberate, designed to create a bond between the chosen individual and the force they were told to embrace. Even when terror stirred within them, they were encouraged to interpret it as a spiritual calling rather than a warning. As the selection phase reached its end, the chosen individuals felt increasingly detached from their former lives. Whether they had volunteered, been coerced, or silently offered by their families, the outcome was the same. They were now bound to a ritual that promised transformation but concealed a reality far more severe. And with each passing day inside the temple, the priests tightened their control, leading the chosen step by step toward the preparations that would define their fate. With the candidates now under the careful watch of the priests, the preparatory phase began in earnest. Every morning, the chosen of fire were led through a series of rituals that seemed benign at first. Incense burned, hymns intoned, and sacred symbols displayed. But each gesture had a purpose. The priests were not only guiding the initiates spiritually. They were shaping their perception of reality, conditioning their minds to accept the inevitable. Candles flickered in shadowed corners, creating illusions of movement, and whispered chants resonated off the stone walls, heightening both anxiety and a sense of mystical connection. Each carefully orchestrated sound and movement reinforced the priest's authority and the perception that stepping into the fire was a divine mandate, not a mortal trial. Isolation became a critical instrument. The chosen were gradually removed from their familiar surroundings and placed in chambers where silence and reflection dominated. This was not for meditation alone. It was to create a psychological dependency on the temple hierarchy. In these confined spaces, every visitor was a messenger of the priest's will. Any small deviation, a look of doubt, a hesitation in speech, was observed and recorded. Some candidates were given fragments of texts, half-remembered psalms, or chants that were intentionally cryptic. The priests watched as the initiates struggled to understand, interpreting confusion as humility, or the inability to resist divine order. It was a cruel feedback loop designed to erode self-confidence, while simultaneously inflating the priesthood's perceived omniscience. As days passed, the chosen were introduced to symbolic tasks that mirrored what awaited them at the altar of fire. They were asked to handle embers, trace flames with gestures, or carry heated coals under strict supervision. These exercises were far from harmless. They tested endurance, precision, and submission. Missteps were met with stern correction or silent reprimand, instilling the idea that failure was not only a personal flaw, but a potential offense against the gods. The priests relied on both awe and fear, balancing glimpses of divine beauty with reminders of the fire's lethal capacity. Each action became a ritualized form of conditioning, reinforcing that the sacred and the terrifying were inseparable. The psychological tension was compounded by peer observation. The chosen could see the uncertainty and anxiety in one another, which amplified individual fear and created a collective pressure to conform. Any hesitation was interpreted as weakness, and weakness was unacceptable. This orchestrated dynamic ensured that the candidates internalized the authority of the priesthood, believing that they alone were unworthy unless they submitted entirely. The priests watched as the chosen individuals oscillated between reverence and dread, carefully steering them toward the mindset that the fire was both a gift and a test that could not be refused. Even at this stage, the surrounding communities felt the unsettling presence of the temple. Neighbors would glimpse smoke rising at unusual hours or hear chanting echoing across the hills. Rumors swirled, stories of selections, sacrifices, and transformations, some distorted by fear, some close to truth. Yet, no outsider could penetrate the inner workings of the sanctum. The priests cultivated this separation, reinforcing the notion that the chosen were elevated and chosen for a purpose beyond mortal understanding, even as each step of the preparation tightened the invisible chains of control and submission. By the time the final preparations began, the chosen of fire were no longer the same individuals who had entered the temple. Their identities had been reshaped, their sense of autonomy diminished, and their perception of duty intertwined inseparably with fear, awe, and the priesthood's unyielding authority. They were now ready, psychologically and physically, for the threshold of the fire, where devotion would meet unimaginable trial. The night of the fire arrived with an intensity that seemed almost unnatural. The temple, perched on the rocky heights, glowed with the reflection of oil lamps, their light trembling across carved stone walls as though warning of what was to come. The chosen of fire, now fully conditioned, were brought to the inner sanctum where the ceremonial pyres awaited. Their hands trembled, not entirely from fear, but from the weight of anticipation and the strange honor that had been ascribed to them. The priests, dressed in ceremonial robes adorned with symbols of flame and eternity, moved with deliberate, measured precision, their movements rehearsed to reinforce both authority and the sacred nature of the event. Every gesture, every whispered incantation was calculated to amplify tension and obedience. As the initiates stepped closer to the flames, the priests recited chants that resonated through the chamber, words that blurred the line between blessing and command. The chosen of fire were instructed to raise their arms, to feel the heat from a safe distance, and to contemplate the divine purpose of their destiny. Observers from the priesthood documented every expression, every heartbeat, the subtle tremors of doubt, the flickers of courage. These were not merely religious leaders, they were masters of human psychology, manipulating the mind and spirit with precision that could rival any battlefield strategist. The fire was more than a physical challenge. It was a crucible for testing loyalty, faith, and the capacity to embrace both awe and terror without faltering. The ritual intensified as the priests called upon the elements, invoking winds, incense, and the flickering shadows to heighten the drama. The body, chosen of fire, were moved in unison, their motions dictated by a rhythm that was both hypnotic and suffocating. For those watching from within the temple, the performance became a test of perception. They were told that hesitation could disrupt the balance between the divine and mortal worlds, that the fire itself would reject any impurity of mind or spirit. This subtle manipulation created a tension that bound the chosen individuals ever tighter to the expectations of the priesthood. Every thought of escape, every flicker of defiance, was subsumed under the overwhelming impression that the flames held a will of their own. Outside the temple, distant communities could feel the weight of what was unfolding. Stories of the night spread in whispers, accounts of figures moving among flames, of voices raised in chants that seemed to merge with the crackling heat. Neighbors spoke of awe and dread, unsure if what they imagined was true or merely rumor amplified by the temple's secrecy. Inside, however, the chosen were entirely immersed in the orchestrated reality. By the time the ceremony reached its climax, many felt a strange sense of transcendence intertwined with terror, the exact reaction intended by the priests. The purpose was not merely to test courage, but to demonstrate that human will could be bent, shaped, and ultimately consumed by devotion and fear. As the ritual concluded, some of the chosen showed visible signs of strain, their bodies trembling, sweat streaking their faces, but their eyes reflected a strange acceptance. They had survived the initial threshold, yet the true trial remained just beyond reach, and the priest's scrutiny had not wavered for a moment. The tension in the chamber, the smell of smoke and resin, and the lingering echoes of incantations created a shared memory of awe and submission that would mark the chosen forever. It was at this moment that the priests turned to the assembled initiates, and, in a voice that carried both command and expectation, invited commentary from the participants, asking them to recount their experience, their fear, and their understanding of divine purpose. And now, viewers, I want you to reflect and share in the comments. Could you endure a ritual that tests both mind and spirit in such a way? How would you respond if faced with what the chosen experienced? Leave your thoughts below, because your engagement helps uncover the reality hidden within these ancient practices. Following the initial confrontation with the ceremonial fire, the chosen of fire entered the next phase of their ordeal, one that tested endurance far beyond the physical. The priests moved them into chambers lined with sacred inscriptions, the walls etched with symbols representing both protection and judgment. Here, the candidates were left to meditate, but it was far from a passive reflection. Every element of the space, the placement of stones, the direction of air currents, the proximity of the firelight, was calculated to amplify both awe and anxiety. The initiates were instructed to focus on the sacred writings while simultaneously remaining aware of the fire in the central pyre, a constant reminder that their fate was intertwined with the divine forces they were meant to serve. The psychological conditioning intensified. The priests employed a combination of sensory cues and ritualized tasks to push the chosen toward a state of heightened obedience. Sounds of chanting from neighboring chambers were amplified, the flickering shadows on the walls seemed to move independently, and occasional bursts of smoke were introduced to evoke the presence of spirits. Those chosen had been trained to respond to signs from the flames, but now the boundary between illusion and reality blurred. They were made to believe that the fire itself could read intentions, punish hesitation, and reward devotion. This manipulation created a constant internal struggle. The chosen had to reconcile fear reverence, and an emerging sense of identity as a vessel for divine energy. As days passed, endurance became paramount. The chosen were required to maintain specific postures, perform repetitive movements, and recite sacred texts for extended periods, all while maintaining a heightened sense of awareness. The priests observed, corrected, and occasionally introduced subtle provocations. An ember closer to the skin, a sudden shift in light, an unexpected sound, designed to test the candidate's capacity to remain composed under stress. The objective was not to inflict immediate harm, but to demonstrate that submission to the ritual was a mental, emotional, and spiritual discipline, as demanding as any physical trial. Simultaneously, the priests emphasized secrecy. Candidates were forbidden from sharing any details outside the temple, and contact with outsiders was strictly limited. This isolation reinforced the idea that the chosen were entering a realm beyond ordinary experience, one that only they and the clergy who guided them could comprehend. The fear of transgressing these boundaries became an additional layer of control, ensuring that obedience and psychological alignment were reinforced at every turn. The chosen began to internalize the temple's authority as an absolute measure of their spiritual worth. Even within the temple, whispers of those who had previously failed or attempted escape circulated, deliberately propagated by the priests. Tales of rejection, punishment, and disappearance served as constant reminders that failure was not merely personal but cosmic, potentially offending the gods themselves. The chosen witnessed subtle demonstrations, such as objects being moved or flames responding in unexpected ways, all interpreted as signs of divine scrutiny. These experiences built a narrative in which the candidate's understanding of self was inseparable from the expectations imposed upon them. Their identity became bound to the ritual, the fire, and the will of the priesthood. By the conclusion of this stage, the chosen of fire had been transformed. Their awareness was sharpened, their fear harnessed, and their submission perfected. They now viewed the coming ceremonial trials not as optional acts, but as inevitable, predestined duties. Every glance at the pyre reminded them of the delicate balance between life and devotion, power and obedience, mortality and transcendence. The preparation had succeeded. The chosen were ready, psychologically and spiritually, for the next stage of the rite, where the fire would no longer be a distant symbol, but a tangible force, demanding complete surrender. The hidden records of the Phoenician priesthood, fragments preserved in clay tablets and obscure scrolls, reveal that the fate of the chosen of fire was far more perilous than most have imagined. Those who attempted to flee or resist at any stage were subjected to measures that blurred the lines between punishment and purification. The priests employed a combination of physical restraint, isolation, and ritualized intimidation, designed not merely to subdue the body but to recalibrate the mind entirely. It was a sophisticated form of psychological mastery, executed with precision, and the surviving accounts suggest that even subtle gestures, such as the placement of a ceremonial torch or the shifting of a sacred symbol, could instill fear sufficient to redirect any impulse of rebellion. The temple itself functioned as a mechanism of control. Its labyrinthine corridors, echoing chambers, and hidden chambers were all designed to disorient and immerse the chosen completely within the ritual space. Sound traveled unpredictably, making the chants and whispered incantations seem omnipresent, while the scent of burned resin and herbs created a sensory association with both divine presence and imminent judgment. The priests understood the human capacity to associate sensory stimuli with emotional states, and they exploited this knowledge to induce a heightened sense of submission. Even the architecture, with its angled walls and enclosed sanctuaries, served as a tool to create tension, emphasizing that the chosen were contained, observed, and ultimately powerless against forces greater than themselves. Accounts indicate that, prior to the main ceremonies, the chosen were often shown visions or illusions designed to evoke terror or wonder, blurring the boundary between the sacred and the terrifying. Reflections in polished bronze mirrors, flames projected across walls, and the rhythmic beating of ceremonial drums contributed to an environment in which the initiates were constantly aware of being both protected and judged. The priests used these techniques to cultivate a dual sense of reverence and dread, ensuring that compliance was experienced as both a moral obligation and a survival instinct. Over time, the candidates internalized these experiences, accepting that their role in the fire rituals was not negotiable, and that resistance was both dangerous and spiritually futile. Some tablets describe incidents where individuals were observed hesitating during preparatory exercises. The priests responded not with immediate violence, but with calculated demonstrations of what could happen in the pyres themselves. Smoke, fire, and ritual implements were used symbolically to remind the chosen of the possible consequences of failure, creating a mental landscape in which fear and devotion became inseparable. This strategic interplay of anticipation and controlled threat ensured that those who reached the final stage were psychologically conditioned to endure extreme circumstances without faltering, their perception of pain, fear, and devotion intertwined in a single experience. The communities surrounding these temples were rarely aware of the full extent of the practices. Traders, travelers, and neighboring city-states only caught glimpses of smoke, chanting, or processions, fueling myths and legends, yet the secrecy reinforced the priesthood's authority, presenting the chosen as chosen not only by fire, but by divine decree. The combination of isolation, ritual, and manipulation created individuals whose loyalty was absolute, whose identity had been reshaped, and whose understanding of the fire had become a fundamental element of their existence. By the time they approached the ceremonial pyres, the chosen of fire were no longer mere initiates. They had been transformed into instruments of the priesthood's will, capable of enduring trials that would break ordinary humans. The moment the chosen of fire were brought before the central pyre marked the climax of both preparation and fear. The temple chamber, lit only by flickering flames, seemed alive with shadows that stretched across every surface, as if the walls themselves were observing the chosen. Priests moved with silent authority, guiding each individual into precise positions around. The ceremonial blaze, every gesture, every nod, every chant was meticulously orchestrated to reinforce the priest's absolute control over both the body and the mind. Those who hesitated, even for a heartbeat, were corrected with subtle but unmistakable demonstrations of the consequences that awaited failure, ensuring the chosen remained acutely aware that every action was observed and evaluated. As the ceremony unfolded, the chosen were instructed to immerse themselves in the symbolism of the fire. Flames were meant to represent divine power, judgment, and purification simultaneously. For many, the heat and light became almost hallucinatory, blurring the boundary between reality and ritualized perception. The priests encouraged this experience, knowing that when fear and awe intertwined, resistance weakened and obedience strengthened. The candidates' senses were saturated. The crackle of burning oils, the shifting shadows, the scent of incense and charred resin, all combined to create a totalizing environment in which thought itself became subject to the priest's influence. Each chosen understood that any faltering could disrupt the sacred equilibrium, and the weight of expectation bore down relentlessly. Within this charged atmosphere, the role of the senior clergy became even more pronounced. They circulated among the chosen, offering guidance, correction, and subtle intimidation, ensuring that each step conformed precisely to the ritual's requirements. Errors were not punished through immediate violence, but through calculated psychological pressure, averted eyes, deliberate silence, the repositioning of symbolic objects, all techniques designed to instill a sense of dread while maintaining the appearance of sacred oversight. The chosen learned to anticipate the priest's expectations, internalizing discipline as devotion and fear as reverence. In this way, the ceremony became not only a test of courage, but a refinement of obedience, shaping the mind as rigorously as any physical trial could shape the body. Outside the chamber, the temple remained shrouded in secrecy. Neighboring communities, hearing only distant chants and glimpses of light through cracks in the temple walls, speculated endlessly about what occurred inside. Tales spread of individuals chosen for divine favor who vanished into fire, of miraculous survival, or of mysterious transformation. The priests used this external perception strategically, cultivating awe and fear beyond the temple walls. By controlling what was seen and what remained hidden, they reinforced their authority both within and outside the sacred space. As the ritual reached its most intense stage, the chosen were fully immersed in the sensory and symbolic power of the fire. Their identities, already reshaped through weeks of preparation and psychological conditioning, were now inseparable from the flame itself. Each candidate faced the realization that surrender to the ritual was not only expected, but essential, that personal desire, fear, or doubt must be subordinated entirely to the sacred mandate. This crucible, simultaneously terrifying and transformative, prepared them for the consequences and rewards that the priesthood would impose. Now, viewers, reflect and share your thoughts in the comments. How would you respond if placed in a situation where devotion and fear were inseparable, where every moment of hesitation could carry immense consequences? Could you endure such a trial? Your reflections matter, and leaving your comment helps us explore the full depth of these hidden rites. As the fire ritual concluded within the temple walls, the ripple effects extended far beyond the sanctuary itself. Neighboring cities and trading communities began to perceive subtle changes in the region's dynamics. Travelers spoke in hushed tones about the mysterious selection of individuals who vanished into flames, about the strange chants and smoke that seemed to rise even in the dead of night. These reports were fragmented and sometimes exaggerated, yet they contributed to a growing aura of fear and respect surrounding the Phoenician priesthood. The influence of the temple extended outward, not through armies or conquest, but through the careful management of perception, legend, and psychological control. The priests understood the power of secrecy and rumor. By maintaining strict confidentiality about the internal workings of the fire rituals, they cultivated an almost supernatural mystique. Outsiders could see only the ceremonial procession, the flickering lights, and the occasional glimpse of those selected, often appearing transformed or withdrawn, their demeanor changed forever. These fragments of information were enough to enforce compliance among local populations and neighboring city-states. The idea that the temple held dominion over both the spiritual and the psychological realm made intervention seem not only dangerous, but futile. The priests had achieved a form of influence that transcended physical borders. Internally, the chosen of fire continued to process the ordeal they had undergone. The intensity of the experience, the combination of sensory overload, fear, and ritualized obedience, had altered their perception of reality. Many accounts suggest that the chosen, after the ceremony, displayed heightened awareness, heightened reverence for the priests, and a persistent connection to the flame that had tested them. They carried these lessons beyond the temple, sometimes acting as intermediaries in local communities, perpetuating the authority of the priesthood through both example and subtle intimidation. The fire, having consumed not just the body but the psyche, became a metaphorical extension of the priest's power. The ripple effects of these rituals also influenced neighboring political structures. City leaders, aware of the temple's capabilities, exercised caution in interactions with the Phoenician priesthood. Diplomacy was tempered by the recognition that the temple could inspire fear, loyalty, or awe without ever raising a weapon. This psychological leverage allowed the priests to exert influence over social, economic, and political matters. Merchants, travelers, and officials often adjusted behavior preemptively, assuming that compliance or respect would ensure safety or favor. In this way, the reach of the rituals extended far beyond the immediate participants, embedding the power of the chosen, of fire, into the wider regional consciousness. Even as decades passed, the influence persisted. Stories, rituals, and practices continued, evolving subtly with each generation. The chosen of fire, whether they survived to mentor others or were replaced by new candidates, became conduits for a cycle that reinforced obedience, awe, and the priesthood's dominion. Their experiences were transmitted not openly, but through carefully controlled narratives, ensuring that the knowledge of the fire's transformative power remained an instrument of control. These ripple effects were subtle, pervasive, and enduring, shaping the psyche of entire communities while maintaining the temple as the singular locus of spiritual authority and fear. Over the centuries, the legacy of the chosen of fire became intertwined with the broader cultural fabric of the Phoenician world. Even as the temple's immediate influence waned and political landscapes shifted, the rituals left a lasting imprint on local mythology, folklore, and communal memory. The stories of those selected, their trials, and the transformative fire ceremonies persisted in oral traditions, sometimes distorted by fear or reverence, but always reflecting the extreme psychological power exerted by the priesthood. These narratives were told in whispers during long nights, passed from parents to children, shaping perceptions of divine authority and the thin line between devotion and terror. Artifacts and architectural remnants of the temples also reinforced this legacy. Inscriptions, symbols, and ceremonial spaces endured, preserving encoded knowledge of the rituals. Scholars examining these remnants centuries later found evidence of calculated design, chambers that directed sound, placements that enhanced light, and symbolic carvings that conveyed both instruction and warning. Each element testified to a sophisticated understanding of human perception and behavior. The chosen of fire were not simply participants. They were living embodiments of a system that had perfected the integration of fear, awe, and obedience into a cultural institution. Their experiences, though often hidden, influenced the collective understanding of sacred authority, leaving traces that resonated far beyond the temple walls. Even neighboring cities, which once regarded the Phoenician priests with suspicion or awe, adapted aspects of these practices in subtler ways. Local leaders and spiritual figures sometimes imitated the psychological strategies observed, applying lessons learned from rumor and observation rather than direct participation. This cultural osmosis spread the principles behind the chosen of fire: ritualized control, spectacle, and the intertwining of fear with reverence into a broader regional consciousness. Through indirect transmission, the rituals influenced political and religious behaviors, reinforcing the understanding that authority was maintained not only through coercion or decree, but through psychological mastery over belief and perception. The transformation of the chosen themselves continued to ripple through generations. Survivors often assumed advisory or mentoring roles within the temple, passing down nuanced understandings of ritual and obedience to new candidates. Their bodies carried the memory of flame. Their eyes reflected knowledge that outsiders could not fully comprehend, and their presence alone became a symbol of the priest's enduring power. Even when the original temples fell or were abandoned, these individuals, living repositories of ritual experience, ensured that the practices persisted in altered form, influencing both spiritual and societal norms across Phoenician culture. By examining these cultural remnants, historians can trace the psychological and social mechanisms that allowed such extreme practices to endure. The chosen of fire, though physically ephemeral in the grand sweep of history, became immortal in the ideas and structures they embodied. Temples, myths, and ritual spaces preserved the memory of obedience, fear, and transformation, allowing future generations to witness, even if indirectly, the complex interplay of power, ritual, and human psychology. The fire's imprint was more than symbolic. It had shaped culture, authority, and the very perception of sacred duty for centuries, leaving traces that continue to intrigue, terrify, and inspire those who uncover them today. The final stage of the Chosen of Fire's ordeal was unlike any preceding trial. By this point, the initiates had been stripped of certainty, molded by fear, and bound by the psychological authority of the priesthood. They stood before the central pyre one last time, the flames reflecting both their own anticipation and the weight of generations of ritual. The priests moved with quiet precision, ensuring every gesture and breath reinforced the sacred narrative. Every element, the scent of burning cedar, the flickering shadows, the rhythmic chants, was designed to command attention, heighten reverence, and solidify the chosen's internalization of their role. The fire no longer represented a distant symbol of transformation. It was now a tangible, all-encompassing force, a crucible in which spirit, mind, and body converged. At this juncture, the priests revealed the full purpose of the selection. The chosen were not merely participants in a spectacle. They were embodiments of divine will, charged with carrying the sacred flame into the broader community, even as the memory of their trials became mythic. Those who survived were entrusted with authority over subsequent initiates, becoming both guides and guardians of a tradition that intertwined awe, fear, and obedience into a continuum of control. Through careful observation, meticulous instruction, and relentless ritual, the priesthood had ensured that the chosen could perpetuate the cycle, maintaining the temple's influence far beyond the reach of political change or social upheaval. The psychological transformation was profound. Survivors emerged with identities irrevocably tied to the fire, their perception of reality reshaped by weeks of sensory immersion, ritualized fear, and structured obedience. Every glance, every step, every breath was measured against the standards instilled by the priests. The chosen carried with them an unspoken understanding. The temple's authority was absolute, its power extending beyond physical walls into the realms of thought, belief, and behavior. They became living symbols of the temple's enduring reach, demonstrating to outsiders and successors alike that the flame commanded not only attention, but complete psychological surrender. As the temple returned to its normal rhythms, whispers of the chosen's endurance spread among the surrounding communities. Observers marveled at their composure, their reverence, and the unspoken authority they exuded. The stories became part of local legend, reinforcing the priesthood's reputation for both divine insight and psychological mastery. The chosen were simultaneously revered and feared, recognized as individuals who had faced unimaginable trials and emerged as conduits of sacred authority. Their presence reminded everyone that the fire's influence was not merely physical, it was enduring, shaping culture, perception, and behavior in ways both visible and hidden. Now, for those who have followed this journey to the very end, your engagement is essential. Leave a comment with the phrase, "I endured the fire," if you have followed the story fully, and share your thoughts on how human devotion and fear can intersect in ways that shape entire societies. If the story moved you, make sure to like this video and confirm that you are subscribed to witness the uncovering of more hidden truths from history's darkest rituals. There is a wealth of knowledge yet to explore, and just as the chosen carried the flame beyond the temple walls, your curiosity can carry these stories into broader understanding. There is a next chapter waiting, another exploration of the mysteries that history has long tried to obscure. Temples, fires, and human endurance. They are all waiting for you to witness what comes next.